Let's discuss Ross chapter 13, sections 4 and 5. This has to do with the perfect conjugation of what are called three aleph verbs. That is, verbs whose third root position is aleph, or the third root letter is an aleph, and also the relative particle asher, which is similar to the English relative pronoun who, which, or that. So let's go through this real quickly, and you'll be able to do your homework. So the perfect conjugation of three aleph verbs. Matzah is going to be the verb that we use as our example for this. Matzah means to find. To find. So do you remember that aleph is it's a part of the guts gang, and that's one of the problems with it. But there's another pesky problem with aleph, and that is that aleph likes to quiesce when it is in a closing position. That is, anytime aleph is the consonant that closes a syllable, consonant, vowel, consonant, creates a closed syllable. Whenever an aleph is right here in closing position, then it will quiesce. Now, it could close the syllable at the end of a word. It could also close the syllable in the middle of a word. Either way, aleph closes, and when aleph is closing, it quiesces and loses its consonantal value. As I like to tell my students, up until we won the World Series this year, and even then it was a bit shaky, but aleph is like a great many Houston Astros relief pitchers. Aleph is a lousy closer. Aleph is a lousy closer. When you want to count on aleph to close a syllable, it messes up and quiesces and disappears. So, it doesn't literally disappear. But here's what happens. When aleph quiesces as the closing consonant of a syllable, it loses its consonantal value. You don't pronounce it as a consonant. It ceases to be pronounced altogether. Any vowel pointing it had, it loses, because we're not treating it as a consonant anymore. And for all intents and purposes, it's treated like it's not there, even though it is written in the Hebrew writing system. So, as far as verbs go, when aleph is the third root letter of a verb, and we call these sort of verbs three aleph verbs, verbs where aleph is the third root letter, it will frequently end up quiescing because, as you look at the Cal-Perfect paradigm, the root 3 consonant is often in a closing position, and this happens when we have those consonantal personal endings. What will happen then is that the preceding short vowel, the pathak, under root 2 will undergo compensatory lengthening because the root 3 aleph quiesces, makes up for the loss of the aleph. We're losing a consonant sound. And that means that the syllable will no longer be closed, and any dagesh lene in the consonantal endings of the perfect personal endings will be blown away by the preceding vowel. So let's take a look at the paradigm for matzah to find. And I've also put next to this the Cal-Perfect of pakad so that you can compare. All right, so let's just start with pakad for a moment. We have two syllables here for the Cal-Perfect 3ms, pakad. And notice that root 3 here is closing this syllable, pakad. Now, matzah should have a short pathak under the sadi. It should have been spelled with the same vowel pointing of pakad, long A, short A. But what's happened here? Well, aleph is closing the syllable. Aleph is a lousy closer. Aleph quiesces and loses its consonantal value. And now it's no longer pronounced. We're treating it like it's not there. And therefore, this is no longer closed. We've lost the consonant aleph in terms of our pronunciation. And the short pathak is going to compensate for the loss of aleph because it quiesced by compensatorily lengthening. And that's why we have a long A followed by a long A instead of the short A that we normally have under root 2. This happens all the way throughout the Cal-Perfect paradigm for the three aleph verbs. So matzah is he found, the long A. Matzah is she found. Remember, we're adding the comma te. Since comma te is a vowel, the aleph is going to remain a consonant. It's not closing anymore. It's sliding over and starting a new syllable with that vowel, because every vowel in a syllable needs a lead consonant. So aleph isn't quiescing, it's opening. It can't quiesce unless it's closing the syllable. So here, it's very normal. Pakada, she appointed. Matza'ah, she found. All right? But over here, pakadta, I have my consonantal ending, ta. The dalet is closing the syllable with the kof here. And so I have that silent shiva. Pakadta. Well, that means that if I were to try to close the syllable using the regular vowel pointing here, it would be matzah ta with a dagesh lene there. This is how it should have been written. Okay, but what happens here? Aleph quiesces and loses its consonantal value, which means it loses any vowel pointing, and we're going to pronounce it like it's not there. This preceding short vowel is going to compensatorily lengthen because of the loss of aleph. And since the aleph is not being pronounced, this kametz is coming directly from here to there. And that dagesh lene that would have been in the tav is going to fall out. And so that's why there is no dagesh lene here. So instead of matzata with the dagesh lene, it's matzatha. Matzatha. Here I had pakad with two silent shavas. Here the aleph quiesced, had the long vowel, and the tav is spelled without the dagesh lene because of the preceding vowel. Remember, we're not pronouncing the aleph, and there's no silent shiva here either. So this is a little bit unusual for you. So matzath, matzath. So matzatha, you found man. Matzath, you found woman. And then I found matzathi, long A, compensatorily lengthened, and no dagesh lene in the top. Over here, we have matza'u, they found. Mutzathem, y'all found. Notice pekadtem has almost all the same vowel points, except where I had a short pathak and the dalet could close with root 3. Here, aleph can't close because it's a lousy closer and quiesces, and I get this long, compensatorily lengthened kamet. In these heavy consonantal endings, we get a vocal shiva under root 1, if you remember. So I'll see that as well. That's normal. But no dagesh lene here. Mutzathem, y'all found. I just switched the mem to a noon for y'all female. So mutzathen, y'all found, and the y'all are women. And then matzanu is we found, like pakadnu, except we have root 3. Here has the silent shiva to pathak, aleph quiesced, compensatorily lengthened. Pathak becomes a kametz here. Matzanu, we found. Alright, so it's fairly easy. Even if you don't remember that dagesh lene can go away with these forms, these tavs, you can still identify who is the subject of the verb by the personal ending. It's still similar enough that you shouldn't have any problem at all. The next section of Ross in this chapter is 13.5, the relative particle asher. What I want to do here is talk about relative clauses first in general, talk about English relative clauses and how we experience them in our language, and then talk about how this works in Hebrew. So first, relative clauses are clauses that modify a noun. Relative clauses are clauses that modify a noun. So that makes them adjectival in function, because that's what adjectives do. Adjectives modify nouns. The blue car tells you something about the car. Well, here, a relative clause is going to modify the noun. And the noun that the relative clause modifies is called the head of the relative clause. Some people prefer to call it the antecedent. I do like to use the word head. Okay, so the head of the relative clause is the noun that comes right before the relative clause that the relative clause modifies. In English, we have relative words or relative pronouns that introduce relative clauses. The relative words that we use are who and forms of who, like whom and whose also. Those are also just different forms of the relative pronoun who. We use which and we use that. So who, which, or that clauses are typically relative clauses in English. So let's take a look at some examples here. And we'll identify the head, the relative clause, and relative pronoun. So I have this first sentence. The lady who won American Ninja Warrior is my pedicurist. Now, what is the relative clause here? The relative clause is who won American Ninja Warrior. That I will label as RC. That's the relative clause. What is its function? This whole clause is modifying the lady. It is telling me something about the lady. If I didn't have the relative clause, I would still have a good grammatical sentence. The lady, which would be my subject, is my verb, my pedicurist. That would be what I like to call a subject complement. And some people would call that a predicate nominative. Okay? The lady is my pedicurist. Now, the relative clause is telling me something about this lady who is my pedicurist. What about her? My relative pronoun is who. And then one is the verb, and American Ninja Warrior is the direct object of that verb. What did she win? She won that contest or that show. How is the who functioning? It is the subject of the verb one. Okay? So my relative pronoun who introduces a relative clause, and it has a subject function inside the relative clause. Let's take a look at the next sentence. President Trump loves his comb-over, which most people dislike. I'm sure I'm speaking for most people. Anyhow, my main clause is President Trump loves his comb-over. The head of the relative clause, which most people dislike, is comb-over. This relative clause here is describing or modifying the comb-over. It's telling me something about his comb-over. What am I saying about it? Well, most people dislike it. That's the relative clause's modifying function to tell you how people are predisposed toward his comb-over. Anyhow, what's my relative word? Well, the relative pronoun is which, and then most people dislike. Most people is my subject inside the relative clause. Dislike is the verb, and actually the function of which is the direct object. Now in this third example, I know the man that swallowed a pound of lard. My relative clause, I'm going to bracket out, that swallowed a pound of lard. The head of the relative clause is man. This relative clause is modifying the man, telling me something about the man. What is it about the man that I know? Well, I know the man that is characterized as having swallowed a pound of lard. He's probably a dead man now. Whatever the case, my relative pronoun is that swallowed a pound of lard. What's the subject of swallowed? Yes, it's the relative pronoun. Swallowed is the verb, pound of lard, direct object. All right? And then last, the hairdo that I prefer is the mohawk. Where is my relative clause? The relative clause is that I prefer. And this relative clause, you compare it to this first one. This relative clause breaks up the main clause, right? The lady is my pedicurist is the main clause. The relative clause intervened. In the second two, the relative clause is just tagged on to the end. But over here now, my relative clause is breaking up the main clause. The main clause is the hairdo, subject, is verb, and the mohawk. That's a subject complement, or again, a predicate nominative. The hairdo is the mohawk. Now this relative clause is telling me something about the hairdo. So hairdo is my head. Pardon the pun. How does the relative clause modify the hairdo, the head? Well, it's telling me something about it. In this case, it's that I prefer a certain kind of hairdo. So there are other hairdos that maybe I don't prefer, but we're talking about the hairdo that I do prefer. So the relative word is that. Now notice, I prefer is my subject and my verb. So how is that functioning inside the relative clause? It is the direct object. Okay? That I prefer, or I prefer that. Okay? So the hairdo that I prefer is the mohawk. Now note here in English, the relative words serve both as conjunctions to introduce a modifying relative clause, and they also serve as relative pronouns that serve a syntactic or grammatical function within the relative clause. Notice we were able to identify the syntactic or grammatical function of each of these relative words. Who, in Who Won American Ninja Warriors, its grammatical function is as the subject of the relative clause. Right? Over here, which not only introduces the relative clause, but it also has a syntactic or grammatical role here. It is the direct object inside the relative clause. That, in I Know the Man That Swallowed the Pound of Lard, not only introduces the relative clause, but it has a syntactic role or function as the subject inside the relative clause. And then finally, the word that in That I Prefer not only introduces the relative clause as a conjunction, but it also has functions as a direct object. That is its syntactic or grammatical role or function. So in English, this happens. The relative word is a conjunction, and it also serves a syntactic or grammatical function also. Another interesting feature of relative clauses is that the relative pronoun and the head always refer to the same referent. A referent is what a word refers to. So if I say, I know Moses, ... okay, he is awesome. The pronoun he has a referent. What does he refer to? He refers to Moses. All right? So, the relative pronoun and the head of a relative clause always refer to the same referent. That is to say, they are co-referential. They refer to the same entity. And then the relative pronoun is sometimes described as resumptive, since it resumes the referent of the head within the relative clause. Let's just take a look at a couple of the examples here. And since I'm writing all over this, I will use a different color here. Okay, so my head is lady. Who is my relative pronoun? Do they refer to the same person? I'll give her some arms here. Yes. The lady who is my pedicurist is the same lady who won American Ninja Warrior. So the head and the relative pronoun, which is also described as a resumptive pronoun, these two are co-referring. They refer to the same entity, the same participant. Take a look over here. President Trump loves his comb over. There's my head. And which is the relative pronoun, and these refer to the same thing, right? They refer to the comb over. President Trump loves his comb over, and his comb over is what most people dislike. Okay? Most people dislike the comb over. Over here, I know the man that swallowed a pound of lard. Man is my head. That is my relative pronoun. Are these referring to the same entity? Is the man referring to the man? Yes. Is the word that referring to the man. That same man, the same man that I know, is also the man that swallowed a pound of lard. So the relative pronoun refers to the same thing or person as the head does. Okay? So you get the idea there. Heads and relative pronouns or resumptive pronouns, they are going to have the same referent. Now, that's just a little bit of introduction to relative clauses in English. How does Hebrew handle relative clauses? The main word in Hebrew that introduces relative clauses is, of course, not the word who, which, or that, but it's the word asher. Asher. So that's how you spell it. This is how you say it. There's a compound shava under the aleph, shin, segol resh. Asher. Asher. Now, like English, Hebrew relative clauses, which I will abbreviate with RC here for relative clause. Hebrew relative clauses have a head. That head is resumed within the relative clause as well. The resumption might be in the form of a resumptive pronoun, or it might be null. That is to say, it might be unstated but implied. Okay, that's what null means. Null means it's not written, but it's implied. Unlike English, however, the word asher is not a relative pronoun. It is rather a relative particle. And here's where I would have to disagree with the way Ross describes it. If you look at Ross, page 110, he calls this a relative pronoun asher. But it's really not a relative pronoun. It is a relative particle, and its only function is to introduce a relative clause. To put it another way, the word asher does not literally mean who, which, or that. Okay? The relative word asher technically might not be translated, although in English we need a relative word, a relative pronoun, to make a good English relative clause. But in English, the relative word has a syntactic role to play inside the relative clause. With Hebrew, the word asher does not have a syntactic or grammatical role to play inside the relative clause. So I want to demonstrate this by looking at 4 examples, okay? And these 4 examples all have to do with the fall of man, not Adam, but just Ha'ish. So I'm using the verb nafal, where nafal is my, not my subject, nafal is my verb, and Ha'ish is my subject, and this is the main clause. The man fell. Okay? The man fell. In every one of these, I have a relative clause that is further describing the man that fell. Okay? So that's what we have here. All of these asher clauses are relative clauses modifying the man who is the subject of fell. So what about the man who fell? Well, remember, relative clauses modify some head noun, don't they? So in every case, Ha'ish is the head of the relative clause. Okay? What do we have introducing each relative clause? Well, we have the word asher, don't we? Because asher serves to introduce relative clauses. But that's the only thing it does. Now let's take a look at this first example. So, nafal ha'ish is the man fell. Which man fell? Well, this asher clause, relative clause, will tell me which man fell. This is modifying ha'ish. Asher, Nathan lo Moshe isha. Okay, we have to figure out what the verb is, which isn't too hard. Nathan, which means to give. Lo is the indirect object to him. Moshe here is actually the subject of Nathan. Moses gave to him. And Isha is the direct object. So, which word in the relative clause, Moses gave him a wife, which one of these words is a resumptive element that is co-referential to the ish, that is the head? It is the lo. The man who or which Moses gave to him, to the man, a wife. You see, in relative clauses, there's always a head, and the head always has an internal function inside the relative clause, usually via an explicit resumptive pronoun. And here it's the 3ms pronoun on the lamed, to him. To who? Well, the him refers to the man. All right, let's take a look at another sentence. Number 2. Nafal ha'ish, the man fell, but this man is going to be described by this relative clause. The man who, or which, who, 3ms pronoun, Nathan gave Moshe, to Moses. So there's my indirect object. This is the subject. There's my verb. And Isha is my direct object here. So what have I got? He gave to Moses a wife. Which one of these is co-referential with the head ish? Right, it is the word who, which is functioning as the subject of the verb Nathan. So notice that in both of these, asher has no syntactic role. Asher is not the subject or the object or the indirect object. Asher is just a relative word introducing a relative clause. What the resumptive pronoun is, here, it's explicit in both of these and it has some role. Here, it's the subject of the main verb. So the man who fell is also the man who did the giving in the second sentence. The man is the one who gave to Moses a wife. In this one, Moses gave the man who fell a wife. Okay, let's take a look at the next sentence. We have Nafal ha'ish, the man fell, and then the Asher clause describes the man. Asher Nathan Moshe Isha. This is almost identical to the sentence. The only difference being that the subject pronoun who is unwritten. And you know that because verbs in Hebrew are already marked for person, gender, and number, you do not have to use an overt subject pronoun here. In other words, the subject pronoun could be missing, it could be null, it could be implied. Okay? So, here's my question. Which element in this sentence co-refers with the head ha'ish? Nathan Moshe Isha. Nathan is the verb. Moshe is the indirect object. Isha is the direct object. None of these participants over here refers to the same person that ha'ish refers to. What is the co-referential element? It is the null subject. The null subject, which is simply unstated, the null subject, the subject of Nathan, is the same as the word ha'ish. So the man who, that man, gave Moses a wife, the man who gave Moses the wife. So, okay, so over here, I'm indicating that he is not overtly written, it's not explicit, and I'm using this null symbol to indicate that I have something missing, but it is implied by the grammar of the sentence, of the relative clause. And now the last example, and this is similar to the one that Ross gives. We have Nafal ha'ish, the man fell. What about the man who fell? Well, the man asher ba'heikal, the man asher in the temple. Now, asher introduces a relative clause. And if it introduces a relative clause, a clause is a complete predication. It makes a statement. It's not just a phrase. It's a clause that has a subject and a verb, whether the subject and verb are explicit or implied. Well, what's the subject? I don't have one. The subject is null. What's the verb? Well, there's not a verb here either. Ba'heikal is a prepositional phrase. So the verb is null. So what I have is an asher clause that has a null subject and a null copula. Null subject, null copula. Remember, the word copula is just the substitute word for the verb to be. Okay? So technically what I have is, since I share does not really mean who, which, or that, it's just introducing a relative clause. What I have is the man, which, I suppose we'd have to translate it that way, the man which he is in the temple. Okay? The man which he is in the temple. So my subject is null, my copula is null, but what is the resumptive element? It's the null subject. The null subject is co-referential with the head here. The null subject, the one who is in the temple, is identical to Ha'ish, who fell. Okay? So this is how relative clauses work in Hebrew. As we go on in our later chapters, we're going to learn a little bit more about relative clauses. We're going to have more examples of them. And I'll just be reminding you of these things that we learn in this chapter.